Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we're going to be looking at some pretty important documents in American history. The Federalist Papers.
The Federalist Papers.
Yeah. They kind of laid the foundation for the government that we have in the U.S. today. Before we get too deep into it, though, I got to ask you, how do you remember learning about the Constitution? Was it all smooth sailing when they were putting it together?
And not at all. I mean, think about it. They just won the revolution, everyone's all excited about freedom, and then their first attempt at a country, the Articles of Confederation, was kind of a dud.
Yeah, it didn't quite.
It did not work.
Correct.
The states were acting like their own little countries, and the federal government was basically useless.
Okay, so a little bit of a mess then.
A little bit.
I'm guessing that's where the Constitution and these Federalist Papers come into play.
You got it. The Constitution was this bold idea to create a much stronger national government.
Right.
But not everybody was thrilled about that idea. Especially in New York, there was a lot of pushback.
Really?
Yeah. And that's where the Federalist Papers come in. 85 essays, published anonymously, all trying to convince people that this Constitution thing wasn't just a good idea. It was absolutely crucial to the survival of this new country.
So kind of like a political PR campaign, 18th century style.
Exactly. They had to get the word out.
So who was the mysterious Publius?
Yeah.
The name behind all these anonymous articles.
Yeah. Well, the secret's out now, of course. But at the time, it was a big mystery. Turns out Publius was actually three guys: Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. Quite the team.
Wow. Talk about a power trio.
Mm-hmm.
And they just whipped up 85 essays to convince everyone. I mean, that's some serious dedication.
Serious dedication.
So some of those essays must have been more influential than others, right? Which ones really resonated and still get quoted today?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. One of the most famous is Federalist No. 10. This was Madison's masterpiece, and he was tackling this huge problem. Factions.
Factions.
Yeah, factions. Think about them like interest groups or political parties today, groups with their own agendas that can sometimes clash with what's good for everybody.
Oh, okay. So basically factions can cause a lot of division.
Exactly. They can make it really hard to get things done.
So what was Madison's solution to this faction problem?
Well, get this. He actually argued that a large republic, like the one they were proposing, would actually be better at dealing with factions than a smaller one.
Okay, wait. A larger republic would be better. How does that work?
His thinking was that in a huge and diverse republic, no single faction could easily take over because there would be so many competing interests that they'd be forced to compromise and work together, which would ultimately benefit everyone.
So kind of like strength in numbers? Even when it comes to disagreements.
Yeah.
That's a pretty counterintuitive idea.
Right.
I mean, that's not something you hear every day.
And then there's Federalist No. 51, another one by Madison. This one's all about checks and balances. You've probably heard of that, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's like the president, Congress, and the courts all having their own powers and keeping each other in check. Like a big game of political tug of war.
Exactly. Madison argued that this separation of powers is absolutely crucial to preventing anyone from becoming too powerful, and that it was the key to preventing tyranny and making sure the government serves the people.
Okay, that one makes total sense. They even taught us about that in school.
Yeah.
But were there any essays that were kind of controversial, even back then?
You bet. One of the most surprising ones was about the Bill of Rights.
Bill of Rights. You mean the part of the Constitution that guarantees free speech and religion?
Yep, that's the one. You'd think everyone would be totally on board with the Bill of Rights, right?
Yeah, I would think so.
Well, Hamilton actually argued against it in Federalist No. in '84. He was worried that listing specific rights would make people think that those were the only RFI rights they had.
Wait, so one of the founding fathers was against the Bill of Rights? That's a plot twist if I ever heard one.
It's wild, right? It shows just how complex these debates were. Even these brilliant minds didn't always agree on what was best for the country.
That's incredible.
And honestly, that tension, that back and forth about the government and individual rights, it's something we're still struggling with today.
I can definitely see that.
But that's a conversation for another time.
Yeah.
For now, remember this. Even the creation of America had its fair share of drama.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
So we've got Hamilton arguing against the Bill of Rights, and Madison coming up with some pretty radical ideas about how to make a government work.
Right.
And this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the Federalist Papers. Right?
Yeah, we just scratched the surface.
So stay tuned because we're going to be diving even deeper into this fascinating world after the break.
Yes, yeah.
So Hamilton was against the Bill of Rights. I mean, it's like the cornerstone of American freedom, right?
I know, right? It seems crazy. But it really shows you how much they were debating and disagreeing back then. They weren't just talking about ideas. They were building a whole new country from the ground up.
And speaking of building, How did the Federalist Papers actually help make the Constitution happen? Were they like a runaway success?
Well, historians still debate just how much they actually convinced New Yorkers to vote for the Constitution.
Hmm.
But one thing's for sure, the Federalist Papers ended up being like the ultimate user manual for understanding the Constitution. Like the Kleist Notes written by the Founding Fathers themselves.
That's a pretty good analogy. So they weren't a smash hit right away, but they became super important over time.
Exactly. Imagine you're trying to understand this brand new document, the Constitution.
Right.
And it's got all these complex ideas and details. What better way to figure it out than by reading essays explaining it all written by the guys who actually wrote the Constitution?
Like having the behind-the-scenes commentary for the making of the United States.
Exactly. And that's why people still study them today. I mean, law students, political scientists, even regular people like us, there's so much we can learn from the Federalist Papers.
So it's not just about history. It's about understanding the logic behind the Constitution.
Right, and how it all fits together. The Federalist Papers tackle these timeless questions. How do you balance individual freedom with a strong government? How do you stop powerful groups from taking away other people's rights? These are still things we're wrestling with today.
Okay, now I'm really starting to see why these essays are such a big deal. They're not just about America's beginnings. They're about building a fair and just society, which is still relevant today.
Absolutely. And here's another really interesting point. In Federalist No. 78, Hamilton lays out the idea of judicial review.
Now that rings a bell. Isn't that the power of the Supreme Court to, like, say if a law is unconstitutional?
You got it. Hamilton argued that the courts need this power to protect against tyranny.
Right.
They need to be able to step in and say, hold on, this law goes against the Constitution. It can't stand.
That's a lot of power. Can you give me an example of how that's worked in the past?
Oh, there are tons of examples. The one that comes to mind is Brown v. Board of Education in 1954.
Oh, yeah.
The Supreme Court said that segregating schools by race was unconstitutional, which totally changed the legal landscape.
Wow, that's a landmark case for sure. So the things they wrote in the Federalist Papers actually changed the course of history.
No doubt about it. The Federalist Papers prove that ideas can have a huge impact. They can shape a whole country and its future.
It's pretty mind-blowing to think about how a bunch of essays published anonymously could have such a massive effect. It shows that history isn't just about dates and names, it's about the power of ideas to shape things.
Exactly. And remember how Hamilton was against the Bill of Rights?
Yeah, I'm still trying to wrap my head around that one.
Yeah.
But we obviously have a Bill of Rights now, so something must have changed. What happened?
Oh.
So Hamilton was against the Bill of Rights, but we have one now, so obviously something changed. What happened?
Well, even though Hamilton was worried about listing specific rights, a lot of people saw the Bill of Rights as essential. They wanted those fundamental freedoms, like freedom of speech and religion,
Right.
the right to bear arms protection from unreasonable searches.
Yeah.
They wanted them spelled out in black and white.
So how do we get from no Bill of Rights to the one we have today?
It's actually a great example of how our system is supposed to work.
Okay.
After the Constitution was ratified, James Madison, who was in the House of Representatives by then,
Right.
he really pushed for a Bill of Rights. He drafted the amendments, and 10 of them were eventually approved by the states in 1791.
So even though they disagreed on this, Hamilton and Madison still worked together to shape the country.
Exactly.
That's pretty amazing, especially when you look at how divided politics are today.
It really is. It shows you that progress often needs compromise and being open to different ideas.
Yeah.
It also proves how smart the Founding Fathers were. They built in a way to change the Constitution, to adapt it as the country changes and grows.
It's like they created a way for us to keep having these important conversations and make changes as we need to.
Right.
Because things change. This whole deep dive has been incredible. But before we wrap up, I gotta ask, what do you think the Founding Fathers would say about the world today?
Oh, that's a tough one. Can you imagine them trying to understand the internet and social media and AI?
Right.
It'd be like something out of a sci-fi movie for them.
Yeah.
But even with all that, I think their main concerns would still be really relevant.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, they were really focused on preventing tyranny.
Right. Yeah.
Today, that could look like debates about government surveillance or data privacy or even the power of big tech companies.
Yeah, those are all things we worry about.
It's all about trying to balance security and freedom.
What else? What else do you think they'd be concerned about?
I think they'd be worried about factions, too. Especially now that misinformation can spread so quickly online. Imagine them trying to make sense of social media and how it influences people, or the rise of extremism online.
Wow. It's like they predicted these problems without even knowing the future.
And let's not forget about the whole debate about federal power versus states' rights.
Right.
That one's still going strong.
Yeah, it is.
Think about things like climate change or gun control or healthcare. It's always a tug of war between the national government and individual states.
So they'd basically be dealing with the same big questions about power, liberty, and government,
Exactly.
just in a totally different world.
And that's what makes the Federalist Papers so cool. They're not just about history.
Right.
They're like a guide for having these important conversations about what kind of country we want.
It's pretty inspiring. So what do we want our listener to take away from this deep dive?
I think the big takeaway is that the Federalist Papers aren't just about the past. They're about right now.
Yeah.
And they're about the future. They remind us that we're all part of this experiment in democracy. And that it only works if we participate and talk about these big issues and wrestle with those tough questions.
It's a great way to put it. It's like they left us instructions for how to make democracy work.
And who knows, maybe someone out there is writing the Federalist Papers for today,
Yeah.
thinking about all these challenges in a new way.
Maybe it's our listener. Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Federalist Papers. It's been a real eye-opener for me.
Me too. Thanks for having me.